diffusion, a very important phenomena for all aspects for material science. But I will not introduce you to diffusion until I try to relate it to previous chapters. So in chapter 6, if you remember, guys, we said that if you add atom B, let's say, did I start the recording? Yeah, okay. Okay, I'm recording. So if we add atom B to an atom A, we can have one situation is we have a solid solution of B in A, meaning that we can have, for example, a substitutional solid solution where we have copper nickel distributed in nickel, copper atoms distributed in nickel, or we can have sometimes some interstitial atoms in the interstitial sites. So we mentioned this one before, okay? This is kind of defects, and this is kind of point defects. And if you add atom P or impurity to atom A, you can have either substitution solid solution or interstitial solid solution. This is what we have mentioned it, okay? So the final shape, it will be something like this or this. But what we didn't mention in the previous chapter is basically how and why.
دكتور
تفضل.
أتوقع ترى الشاشة مو طالعة عندي.
Is it the same for all of you guys?
طالع.
Okay, let me try to do it again. What about now?
Yes, now, yes.
Okay. طيب. So we didn't mention how this is happening and why is it happening. We know that at the end it will be just copper and nickel, for example, or carbon and iron. It will be either substitutional or interstitial, but we didn't mention anything about the mechanism, how this is happening and why this is happening. And this is basically the essence of this chapter, the diffusion, is try to answer these questions. So the objective for me is to understand basically the two atomic mechanisms for diffusion and to develop some fundamental knowledge on both steady state and non-steady state diffusion, and finally to know the factors that influence the diffusion. So these are what we're going to mention inshallah ta'ala in this chapter. So first of all, what is diffusion? The diffusion is basically a mass transport by atomic motion. So if you consider, for example, this atom here, now it's trying to move, okay? Just try to focus, you will see it's moving, okay? So the mass transport by atomic motion is diffusion. This is the simplest and most effective definition of diffusion, is the mass transport. There's a material that is transported by atomic motion, by the motion of atoms. And there are two types. The first type is something called interdiffusion, which is basically happening in alloys, since we are talking only about metals in this case. We are having in alloys. So atoms tend to migrate from region with high concentration to region with low concentration. For example, let me give you an example here just to explain the definition of interdiffusion. Here we have atoms B, and here we have atoms A. The atoms B in orange, the atoms A in gray here. If we are to draw some concentration profile, we would make sense here that the atoms in atom B will be 100% until we reach to some interface here. And the interface, after the interface, it will be 0. There is no atom B in this region here, which makes sense. So this is the concentration profile. And by the way, this thing here is called diffusion couple, because we have a couple here, two metals attached to other. This is diffusion couple. And if you look at the other extreme, we have atom A at 100% concentration, and then once it reaches to the interface, it will drop sharp to 0. Makes sense, Shabab, wala? Does it make sense? I mean, this diagram, the concentration profile.
Yeah, it makes sense.
Okay, so after some time, what's happening is that you will start to notice that the atom in the B atoms will migrate to other regions here, and the atom A will migrate to other regions here. And this is basically the interdiffusion. You see, the atoms tend to migrate from regions with high concentration to regions with low concentration. And finally, you will, so we need to modify the concentration profile. So at the very extreme, yes, it's 100%. But if we assume this is the interface here, you will see that the decrease is not sharp like here, but there's a decay in the concentration profile. The same thing can be said with the atoms A, that the atom is 100%, but until we reach to the interface, there is a decay, not a sharp decrease. So this is the basic, or this is the interdiffusion definition by example. This is the interdiffusion. It's happening between a diffusion couple, atom A, atoms B, attached together. There'll be some diffusion if given sometimes, and sometimes we need temperature for that case. We're going to learn about it, inshallah ta'ala, toward next class. This is the first type. It's called interdiffusion. The second type is called self-diffusion, which is basically happening within the same element here. So if you initially, we have all of it is basically atom B here, all of it. But we can basically define C, A, D, B as the position of specific atoms. After sometimes, if you give it sometimes, you will notice that the atom C, that it's moved to some other places, atom A moved to other places, D, B, they shattered, okay? There's a random distribution. So the difference between the self-diffusion, as in this case, and the interdiffusion is that the interdiffusion happening between two different elements, the self-diffusion happening with the same element. Okay, so these are the two types for diffusion. So now we know the types, but we don't know the mechanism or how this is happening. And to answer this, we need to understand the mechanisms of diffusion. And again, we have two mechanisms of diffusion. And the first one, before we talk about the mechanism or the types of mechanisms of diffusion, I think it's important to know that for a diffusion to happen, there has to be two rules for the atom. First, there has to be some empty adjacent site, meaning there is a space, there is an empty adjacent site where the atom can move to, okay? So empty adjacent site, this is the first rule, empty adjacent site. And the second rule, the atoms has to have some, it has to have energy enough to break the bond here, and energy enough to form new bonds here. So these are the two rules, and makes sense. So if there is no space, here, then this atom cannot move anywhere, okay? So this is the first thing. And the second thing, if the atom doesn't have energy to break the bonds and forming new bonds here, then basically diffusion will not happen. So these are the two essential rules for diffusion to happen. Empty adjacent site, and it has to have enough energy. So the first type of diffusion is called the vacancy diffusion. By the name, it happens through the vacancy exchanging positions with atoms. So atoms exchanging position. For example, in this case, the atom here, it sees a position, empty space, a vacancy, and it has enough energy, so it will move to this position. Okay. After that, now we can continue the cycle. That this atom here sees a position, it has energy, it will move. So this is called the vacancy diffusion. This is one mechanism of diffusion. It's called the vacancy diffusion. And it happens to both. It is applicable to both substitutional impurity atoms, meaning interdiffusion, meaning the atoms moving as an impurity to host place here. Or it happens to the self-diffusion, meaning that here is the position of the atom, let's say this is B, so atom B is migrating to a position of atom B. So the two types of diffusion that we mentioned, the interdiffusion and self-diffusion, can happen through the vacancy diffusion, And the final thing, and this is very important, that the rate, how fast this process can happen, depends on two things. One is the number of vacancies, and two is the activation energy to exchange. Now, let me ask you, Shabab. So if you have higher number of vacancies, do you think the process will be faster or lower? The rate will be higher or lower if you have a higher number of vacancies?
Higher.
Yes, good. So this makes sense. Now, the activation energy, basically the energy needed for this process to happen. If you have higher activation energy, do you think the rate will be higher or lower?
Lower.
Lower, good. And the final thing is that if the atom has high energy, pay attention.
Higher.
Do you think the rate will be higher or lower?
Yeah, the rate will be higher.
Huh? Exactly. Exactly, correct. So these are very, very good points for MCQs. Okay, very good. So the first mechanism is called the vacancy diffusion, and the second mechanism is called interstitial diffusion, which is basically smaller atoms can diffuse between atoms. So here we have smaller atom, interstitial sites, and then it can migrate to another interstitial site. So basically we are talking now about small atoms happens between atoms of the host here. Now let me ask you, so for the vacancy diffusion, we mentioned that it can happen to both interdiffusion and self-diffusion. So for the interstitial diffusion, does it happen also for both or for one of them?
Both.
Both of them.
Both of them? So do you think the atom, this atom, can migrate into interstitial sites here?
No, of course.
No. Why?
Because the first rule, the adjacent.
Yes, there is no vacancy, صح ولا لا? But there is a vacancy for the smaller atom, صح? There is a vacancy here, here for the smaller atom, but the big atom doesn't have, okay? So the interstitial diffusion happens only for interstitial impurity atom, for the interdiffusion, okay? So you cannot have the same element doing interstitial diffusion. The mechanism cannot happen through the interstitial diffusion. For self-diffusion, it happens only through the vacancy diffusion, only, okay? Does it make sense, Shabab? Is it clear or not? If it's not clear, just let me know. Yeah, I will repeat it. Okay, then I guess that's clear. طيب. So now my second question, okay? So first of all, remember, Shabab, remember, okay? We said that there are two rules, one empty adjacent site and enough energy. Now let me ask you, do you think the interstitial diffusion, the rate will be higher or lower than the vacancy diffusion? I mean, how fast this is happening?
I believe higher.
Why?
Because there is more adjacent sites.
Exactly, this is correct. So yes, it will be more rapid because it has first, it's smaller atom, it has higher mobility, it has higher energy. And the second thing, very important, there are more empty interstitial sites or empty adjacent sites, okay? So that's why for the vacancy, for the interstitial diffusion happening much rapidly compared to the vacancy diffusion. So this is good, but what we have done so far is just we're talking about this is rapid, this is very slow, it will be higher, it will be lower. It will be very good if we can quantify this this value, I mean how rapid the diffusion happening. So we can quantify it by the rate of diffusion. Basically to answer how do we quantify the amount of rate of diffusion? By something called the flux, diffusion flux, J, which is basically that it's the mass of diffusing species divided by the area divided by the time, meaning that we can do exactly the same experiment here. We can we can do an experiment that if we have like a membrane with a known cross-sectional area, and we expose the membrane to some concentration, to some mass, let's say, or moles or whatever, and then we quantify how much concentration or mass outside, okay? So then we can basically draw this diagram here, which is the mass of diffused with time. You will see with time, the mass diffused will be high, will increase. The J, the flux, equal to M divided by AT. The A, we know it, dm by dt, we can take the slope from here and substitute here to find the value of the flux. So this is just a general way experimentally how to quantify the flux. Okay, but we are interested in how to find it theoretically, okay, theoretically from calculation. But we don't know to do experiments here. So we find out that there are two scenarios. One is called steady state diffusion, and the other one is called non-steady state. The non-steady state we're going to talk about inshallah ta'ala next lecture, but we're going to focus on the steady state in this lecture here. So in this steady state here, we are talking about a situation where the concentration at any given point is not a function of time. Meaning, I think it's better to exemplify it. Have you heard about hydrogen, ya shabab? Hydrogen as an energy, like for example, hydrogen powered car, fuel cells, or something like this. Have you heard anything related to it?
Hydrogen bomb.
Hydrogen bomb. I'm not sure if there's some. I don't know, but what I can tell you that the hydrogen can be used as an energy carrier. Okay. So we can use the hydrogen as a source of energy. And there are some like internal combustion engine, there is something called fuel cells. And fuel cells can use hydrogen in order to basically power the car. But one of the annoying problems with using hydrogen as an energy carrier is very difficult to store hydrogen. Hydrogen is very small. It's not like gasoline that you can store it in steel and that's it. No, hydrogen is very small, so it's very hard to store hydrogen. And that's why the storage for hydrogen, usually it has an efficiency. So we can use any material, and we have hydrogen here, and here we have air, so we store hydrogen. So usually there will be some leaking of hydrogen because again, it's very small to the air. So we can assume this is hydrogen here, and this is basically the wall, which is this wall here, thickness wall, and this is, let's say, air. So the concentration of hydrogen inside is high, but the concentration outside is low. This is a classical example of the steady state diffusion, where the concentration here and the concentration here is not a function of time. It does not change. If you look now, if you look after 10 minutes, the concentration is the same. The situation is different when we're talking about the concentration will change with time. This is the non-steady state. But for the steady state, no, the concentration is not a function of time. So we can basically, we can basically get something called the flux again, which is diffusion flux. And the flux is proportional to this dc by dx. And this is sometimes called the driving force, And we can formulate this equation, a very well-known equation. It's called the Fick's first law of diffusion. The diffusion flux here, how much material is going through this membrane, equal to minus D, and the D here is diffusion coefficient. We're going to talk about inshallah ta'ala later in the next class in details. And we have dc over dx, and dc over dx is called the driving force in this case. So if you increase the dc by over dx, you will end up with a higher j. If you increase the diffusion coefficient, you will end up with a higher j. So this is the first Fick's law, is very important rule, is equal to J equal minus D, diffusion coefficient, dC over dx. The diffusion coefficient is material dependent. We're gonna look at it inshallah ta'ala in details in next class. Okay, so if it's linear, I mean the slope is linear, we can of course simplify it to delta C over delta X, delta C over delta X. So since I stopped right here at the first section, I don't want to go ahead with solving the example. This is the situation always happening, that the first section is taking much more time than your section. So I don't want to go into the example since I haven't covered the example in the first section, and I want you all to be on the same pace. طيب, any question يا شباب? Okay, hopefully it's clear. طيب. Go ahead.
D coefficient هذا dependent على الماتيريال حق الغاز مثلا في مثال الهيدروجين ولا
both.
الوول؟
It depends على اللي هو impurity gas ولا whatever, وعلى الhost atom.
Okay.
So it's a function of both. We're gonna look at it inshallah ta'ala next class. So for example, if you're diffusing a species, let's say if you're diffusing carbon into iron, is different if you're diffusing oxygen into iron. Okay, so you see is depending on the impurity atom, but also carbon and copper. So it depends also on the host atom. So both, and also it depends on other factor, the temperature, stuff like this. We're gonna talk about inshallah in the next class. طيب, any more questions, شباب?